I'd like you to welcome you to section 4.1 for our podcast. In this section, we are going to be looking at population dynamics. This section is going to start on page 92, and we are going to be looking at the characteristics of populations and how those populations are distributed. We're also going to look at the carrying capacity and limiting factors that affect those populations. So first of all, we need some terms when we talk about our characteristics of our population. The first thing is the population density. Now, when we talk about a population, usually we like to know how crowded it is. So we're going to talk about the population density, the number of organisms in a given area. We're also concerned about how those organisms are distributed in that area. So we're going to talk about the spatial distribution. Now on page 93, we have three different characteristics in terms of their dispersion patterns. The first one is a uniform dispersion pattern. This is in a given area, organisms are going to be uniformly dispersed. The example in your book is the American black bear. Black bears have very set territories. And so in a given biome or in a given ecosystem, you're going to see a very uniform pattern in how those black bears divvy up that space for their territory. The next one is the clumped dispersion. This is where we have organisms that travel in herds. So within that ecosystem, you may see several different herds of organisms, like the American bison. And the third one is a random dispersion. Now in this one, we have a given habitat, but how the organisms are spread throughout that habitat is random, like white-tailed deer. They roam around, sometimes they're together, sometimes they're not. And so they have a very random pattern in how we find them. Another thing that we need to talk about is when in this spatial distribution is that the abiotic factors can really affect where those populations can go. We talked in chapter 3 about your range of tolerance, and it has like oxygen levels change, or the elevation changes, or temperature changes. It affects whether that organism is well suited for that environment or not. And this is the same thing. As the abiotic factors change, it affects that distribution pattern. So in the bottom right, we have this pupfish, and it lives in Nevada in a hot water spring. And if you get too far away from the spring, the water cools down, and so we don't see it. So we would see probably a very clumped dispersion pattern where we could go throughout the entire spring, and then we would see a clump of pupfish, and then we would go for a while, and then we wouldn't see it anymore, and then we could see another clump of them around another hot spring. So when we talk about our populations, we need to talk about how dense they are, how many of them are in a given area, and how are they distributed. Are they clumped? Is it random? Or is it a very uniform dispersion pattern? Recall also in chapter 3 that we talked about limiting factors. Remember, limiting factors are anything biotic or abiotic that limit how big a population can get or where a population can go. Well, in this chapter, we're going to define that a little bit better, and we're going to have density dependent and density independent factors. Now, density independent factors is just what it says. It is a limiting factor that is independent, or it does not depend on the number of organisms that are already there. For example, the weather. If it's going to flood, or if there's a drought or a hurricane or a tornado, it really doesn't matter how many organisms are there. It's still going to limit their ability to survive. Likewise, a fire. A fire doesn't depend on how many gazelle are there, whether it's going to affect the gazelle population. Human alterations, we affect the landscape. We build roads that affect the migratory patterns. We wipe out minor ecosystems when we build buildings or when we build cities and towns. And we don't really take into account, we don't build because there's 100 ants versus 50 ants. Okay? It still affects the population. And then pollution. Pollution is going to affect the number of organisms that we can have. Once again, whether there's 5 of them or 100 of them, any type of pollution would limit how big those populations can get. So those are density independent, right? It does not matter on how many organisms there are, it will still affect their population size. The next limiting factor was density dependent. Now these are things that it does depend on the number of organisms that are there. It's density dependent. So biotic factors, like, do you have enough food? If I'm a predator, do I have enough prey? Do I have enough grass to eat? Okay, those would be density dependent. The bigger my population gets, the less food there is. That starts limiting how big my population can be. Disease. Disease is very density dependent. The more organisms you put together in a small space, the faster disease spreads. Getting a cold when you first come back to school is density dependent. In the summer, you're outside, you're not around 500 of your closest friends, and so you don't normally get a cold or anything during the summer. Those first couple weeks, we came back to school, we're in an enclosed building, now there's 500 of us sharing the same space, and colds, being sick, starts to spread through the population faster. It's density dependent. Another thing is competition. The more organisms you have to compete with, it could limit your population size. And then parasites. That kind of goes along with disease, that as there's more organisms to infect, it could limit the population. So when we talk about population, and we talked about what can limit a population, and we know where populations live, we can talk about the population growth rate. And this is the PGR is telling us how fast that population is growing. Now, it's going to depend on a couple things. It's going to depend on how many organisms are being born in that given time period, or the natality of a population. It's also going to depend on the mortality. How many organisms are dying? So when we look at the growth rate, it's how big is that population growing? Is it growing by leaps and bounds and there's lots more babies being born than what's getting killed off? Or are they kind of going slow and steady and there's not too many newborns compared to older organisms? When we look at the growth rate, there's 2 different ways that we can visualize how a population is growing. The first one is called the exponential growth model. Now, the exponential growth model is when the growth rate is proportional to the size. So we go through this big, long time of a lag phase, which means the population is growing, but it's still pretty small. And we eventually get to the point where the population is going to skyrocket. It reminds me of like a ski slope. So if we start off with 2 mice, they make 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. For example, way back here when we get up to like 19 months, all of a sudden now we go from what looks like 0. Within 2 months, we're to 250,000. Within another month or 2, we're up to 500,000. Then we go up, by 23 months, we're already at 1 million. 2 months later, we're up over 3 million mice. So we have this big lag phase, and then we have a big section of exponential growth. Now, an exponential growth model isn't a very realistic growth model. We can see this kind of growth model in the lab when we're working with mice or bacteria, where we have unlimited space, we have unlimited food, and there are no predators. This doesn't happen in the environment. It doesn't really happen. We have to simulate this in the lab. What we normally see is something called the logistic growth model. Now, in the logistic growth model, we still have this lag phase that's going on, and then It doesn't happen. We still have the exponential phase. But what happens is we have some type of limiting factor that's going to happen up here at the top of our S curve, where we're going to run out of food, or we're going to have a predator, or there's going to be too much competition. And something is going to happen that's going to make our population level off. Now, what we would really actually see is that we would go above the carrying capacity, then our population would drop back down, and then it would level off again. So the logistic growth model is what we actually see out in the environment, where we have a lag phase. We see this big S curve and this exponential growth as our population skyrockets, but then eventually something happens that limits how many organisms can actually live there. And that's called the carrying capacity. How many organisms can actually live in that environment? And every population is going to have its own carrying capacity. The carrying capacity for mice is going to be different than for rabbits, which is going to be different than for a fox. Okay? It just depends on the environment and the different limiting factors that are there. When we reach our carrying capacity, when we stop increasing, this is when the number of births that we have is going to be less than the number of deaths. Okay? So we have less, or the number of births is equal to the number of deaths, and our population is going to kind of level off. If we have animals that can move, it's going to be when immigration exceeds immigration. Okay? So the people moving out are going to exceed the number of organisms moving in. And we don't see that too often with other animals. We see that with human population more. Okay, so once again, the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that an environment can support for the long term. Okay, the carrying capacity. And once again, it's limited by those limiting factors. How much energy is there? Do you have a food supply? Okay, that's the big one. That's how we get our energy. Is there enough water? Is there enough oxygen? Is there enough shelter? Those things that we talked about populations compete for, that's going to really determine our carrying capacity and how big those populations can get. Okay. What determines that let me back up here, that S curve, and how fast that S curve happens, or how fast those organisms speed up and how many organisms are being born, has a lot to do with the reproductive pattern of a species. Now, different species have different reproductive patterns. They vary in how many births they have a year, how fast that happens, how old the female usually has to be in order to reproduce. Some organisms can reproduce right away, others have to wait several years. And how long do those organisms live? If I live a long time and I can have lots of babies every year, the population is going to grow faster than if I'm an organism that lives a long time, but I'm only going to be able to have one or two offspring before I'm done. So it all depends on the reproductive pattern of these offspring. And we have two different kind of reproductive patterns that most organisms fall into. The first one are organisms that follow the R strategy, or an R strategist. Now, these organisms are used to living where there's lots of changes. Their biotic and abiotic factors change. Their environment changes really fast. These guys are little, they're small, so we're talking like rats, mice, bugs are R strategists. They are small. They don't live very long in comparison to other organisms, and they're going to have lots of offspring. Okay? They're going to be able to reproduce really, really fast. So if there's a change in the environment, like the temperature all of a sudden gets colder or hotter, or the food source changes, they're producing so many offspring that they're able to keep up with those changes, so their species is going to be able to handle that. The other type are called K strategists. These are carrying capacity strategists. These are big organisms. These guys are used to living, and they're made to live in a stable environment, something that's not changing a lot. like I said, these are larger organisms. They're going to have a nice long lifespan like humans. And they're also going to produce very few offspring. Another example of a case strategist is an elephant. They produce very few offspring. They take a lot of care in raising those offspring. They're going to live normally for a very long time. But their environment is really stable. As we've seen this, as their environment is changing, they're not reproducing fast enough in order to keep up with the changes that are happening. So our strategists, like rats, mice, bugs, little guys, are able to change really fast because they're producing lots of offspring, but they're not living very long. Case strategists, on the other hand, get to that carrying capacity. They like that nice stable environment where we don't see a lot of changes in the biotic and abiotic factors. They're going to have very few young. They're going to invest a lot of time and energy into raising those young to make sure that they survive, and they're going to live for a very long time. So that wraps up section 4.1. We talked about population characteristics, the idea that we have different distribution patterns. We have random, uniform, or clumping patterns in how those organisms are distributed throughout their ecosystem. That we have our two different growth patterns, and that populations usually stabilize next to that carrying capacity, where we see that lag phase, then we get that nice exponential curve, and then in that logistic growth model where they level out at the top and they reach their carrying capacity, and that our limiting factors and where that carrying capacity can be reached can either be density independent or density dependent. Density independent, again, remember, does not depend on how many organisms there are. Density dependent, it does matter how many organisms there are in order for that to be a limiting factor.